Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on paradox questions in the logical reasoning section. About 7% of all logical reasoning questions are paradox questions, and the type of thinking that pays off on these questions also pays off on weakened questions and on strengthened questions, so any improvement you can make on one of those three question types will have an influence on the other. In today's lesson, we're going to cover the following four things: how to spot a paradox question, what's the process that you want to take when approaching one, what kinds of reasoning structures can you expect to see within the stimulus and how do you deal with them? And what kinds of trap answer patterns should you be on the lookout for when you're working through the answer choices? So let's get started with how do you spot a paradox question. In this question, we're asked, which one of the following, if true, most helps to resolve the apparent paradox? Well, we see some language cues in here. They're asking us to resolve a paradox. Most helps to resolve a paradox. So if you see the word paradox, you're on a paradox question. If you see the word resolve, that would also indicate that you're on a paradox question. In this question stem, which one of the following, if true, most helps to explain the study's results? Well, the words most helps to explain tells us that we're on a paradox question. Or here, each of the following, if true, helps resolve the apparent discrepancy above except. So again, we get language that says to resolve the apparent discrepancy or apparent paradox. But notice that this one is an except question, and this is going to be quite common on paradox questions. This is a question type where we get more except questions than normal. The process we want to take when approaching a paradox question is fairly straightforward and mostly intuitive. We want to first start by finding the unexpected result. Something strange happened, and we either need to explain how it occurred, or two things that seem like they're conflicting with each other are both stated, and we need to show how they can both be true at the same time. And then we want to anticipate the answer. So for this, we want to think about what could explain the situation or what would resolve the paradox. Typically, there are many things that could explain something strange. And so we have to be careful that we're aware that the thing that we anticipate may not show up in the answer choices. And we need to be open-minded to other ideas for how to explain the strange situation. Then as we move through the answer choices, looking for that answer choice that gives us that explanation or resolves the paradox, we want to be on the lookout for certain kinds of trap answer patterns that are really close, but not quite. So here's an example question. Go ahead and give this one a try on your own. See if you can find an answer that you like. So hit pause, and then when you're ready to discuss this together, hit play again. And I'll use this as an example to show you some of the characteristics of paradox questions. All right, welcome back. So one thing to keep in mind here is that we don't have an argument in front of us. We have a set of facts. So we don't have to take any steps in terms of evaluating the argument. We don't need to find the conclusion and find the evidence that is used to support that conclusion or evaluate that argument, try to find the gap in its reasoning. In some ways, this is a lot simpler. All we need to do is figure out what was the expectation or what should have been reasonably expected, and then what happened. What we want to do is first figure out what the expectation should have been, but then also what the result turned out to be. There's going to be a mismatch between what we expected to occur, or what could have been expected to occur, and what actually happened. And anything that can explain the difference between what our expectation would be and what actually occurred would help to resolve or explain the greater decline among sugar maples. So the expected result comes from that first sentence. When a forest is subject to acid rain, the calcium level in the soil declines. And then spruce, fir, and sugar maple trees all need calcium to survive. So basically, acid rain is going to be bad for these kinds of trees. The actual result is that sugar maples were more likely to display calcium deficiency than firs and spruces when forests of each type were hit by acid rain. So why was there a mismatch between the way sugar maples were affected by the acid rain versus firs and spruces? And if we can come up with a couple of good ideas that can explain the discrepancy, well, then we've got a good anticipation going into the answer choices. If we're having a hard time anticipating an answer here, we can also start to think about reasoning structure as well. In this one, what we can see is that we've got a difference between the way acid rain affects sugar maples and the way it affects firs and spruces. So this discrepancy is actually a comparison. And this is really, really common on paradox questions, that the stimulus presents some kind of a comparison, a discrepancy, a difference, and then they ask you to explain that difference. And so most of the time in the answer choices, you're going to feel like you're picking a choice that actually is the causal explanation for that discrepancy or that difference. We see a lot of comparison in the stimulus as well as a lot of causal assertions in the answer choices. So what could explain the difference? Well, there should be many things, right? And so we should be fairly open-minded, and we should also keep in mind that the things that we anticipate may not show up in the choices. Notice that this is a causal explanation for the discrepancy. Maples have shallow roots would be the cause of the difference in the way acid rain affects these different kinds of trees. And so we're expecting to see a lot of causal assertions or causal claims in the answer choices to explain the discrepancies that are listed inside of the stimulus. Another thing that could explain the discrepancy would be that maybe firs and spruces store calcium differently than maples do. If the firs and spruces are able to store calcium in a way that keeps it around for longer, have deeper reservoirs inside, then maybe it would take a lot more for those trees to be damaged by the acid rain compared to the maple trees. So these are a couple of ideas, but remember, we can't guarantee that the right answer is going to be one of these, but it's a really good idea to stay engaged with the material and to be anticipating. Answer choice A says that soil in which calcium levels are significantly diminished by acid rain is also likely to be damaged in other ways by acid rain. So what is this answer choice talking about? It's talking about soil in which calcium levels are significantly diminished by acid rain. And they're not specifying where. So this is going to be true for the firs and spruces as well as for the sugar maples. Since this answer choice applies to both kinds of trees, it can't explain the difference between the maples and the firs and spruces. So this one we can get rid of because it applies to both, and this is a really common trap answer pattern on paradox questions. Answer choice B says that sugar maples that do not receive enough calcium deteriorate less rapidly than spruces or firs that do not receive enough calcium. The key here is that sugar maples that do not receive enough calcium deteriorate less rapidly. This provides a benefit to sugar maples relative to firs and spruces. And what we're looking for is something that explains the calcium deficiency, why they are so likely to display calcium deficiency relative to firs and spruces. So these sugar maples that are not receiving enough calcium deteriorate less rapidly. This actually deepens the paradox, and we can get rid of this choice. This is very similar to an answer choice that weakens an argument on a strengthened question, or an answer choice that strengthens an argument on a weakened question, or an answer choice that contradicts a set of statements on a must-be-true question. Answer choices that do the opposite of what you're looking for can sometimes be very tempting. Answer choice C says, spruces and firs, unlike sugar maples, can extract calcium from a mineral compound that is common in soil and is not affected by acid rain. So this gives spruces and firs a mechanism by which they can get that calcium, or at least more calcium, relative to the sugar maples. So even when the calcium in the soil has been depleted from the acid rain, these spruces and firs are able to access calcium from a mineral compound that protects them. So this actually looks pretty good. This can give us a difference between the spruces and firs relative to the maples. Answer choice D says that sugar maples require more calcium in the spring and summer than they do in the fall and winter. So this is giving us information about what sugar maples do and how much calcium they require in different times of the year. This is comparing sugar maples at one time of the year against sugar maples at another time of the year. But what the statements are about is comparing sugar maples against firs and spruces. So answer choice D is giving us a comparison and an irrelevant one. We don't really care how sugar maples compare to themselves at different points in time. We care about how sugar maples compare to firs and spruces when they're washed out with acid rain. Answer choice E says that unlike spruces or firs, most sugar maples are native to areas that receive a lot of acid rain. Well, this is talking about sugar maples that are native to areas that receive a lot of acid rain. If what we were trying to explain is why sugar maples are exposed to a lot of calcium deficiency from acid rain, while firs and spruces are not, this could be an explanation of that oversimplification. But if we look very carefully inside of the stimulus, we're talking about a comparison between firs and spruces that are washed out with acid rain and sugar maples that are washed out with acid rain. But this answer choice doesn't explain why sugar maples that are exposed to acid rain are more likely to show the deficiency than firs and spruces that are also exposed to acid rain. So we got to get the comparison right. As it is, this is an irrelevant one. And so that leaves us with answer choice C as the correct answer. Here's another one. Go ahead and give this a try. Hit play again when you're ready to discuss, and we'll walk it through together. All right, welcome back. So we're told after replacing his old gas water heater with a new pilotless gas water heater that is rated as highly efficient, Jimmy's gas bills increased. Well, what happened? One would expect, given that he replaced his old gas water heater with a new pilotless gas water heater that is rated as highly efficient, that the gas bill would actually go down. This is a highly efficient, he's replacing an old gas heater. One would expect the bill to go down if it's so efficient. But what happened? Instead, Jimmy's gas bills increased. So the expectation was that the bills would go down, or one would expect that the bills would go down, but the result was that the bills went up. How could that be? If we can think of a couple of good ideas, that'll put us in a good place, especially since this is an accept question. What that means is that 4 of these answer choices are going to explain how this happened, and the one that doesn't is the right answer. So what could explain why the gas bill would go up instead of going down? Well, maybe the utility company is just going to charge higher rates. So even though Jimmy's using less gas, the rates are higher, and so the bill goes up anyways. The other thing that could explain the increase in the gas bill would be maybe more appliances or more usage of the gas fireplace or anything that uses gas. We're talking about the gas bill. We're not talking about the electricity bill. So we want to make sure that the appliances that are indicated would be ones that would be using or consuming gas. But if Jimmy installs a bunch of new gas-powered appliances, then yeah, even though Jimmy's gas water heater is more efficient, those other devices could be consuming any of the savings and maybe even leading to an increase in the bill. So let's go look at the choices and see. I'm expecting 4 of them to explain this. The one that doesn't is the right answer. But that doesn't mean that the right answer is going to make the situation more confusing. It means that the 4 answer choices that resolve or explain the situation, anything left over would be the right answer, meaning it could be irrelevant. It could make the situation worse. We don't really know. 4 of the answer choices will explain it. We're going to get rid of them. Answer choice A says that the new water heater uses a smaller percentage of the gas used by Jimmy's household than did the old one. So it's using a smaller percentage of the gas, the new one. That makes it more efficient. This is actually very much in line with the expectation, not with the result. If anything, this might actually make the situation more confusing, not less confusing. So we might have gotten lucky with answer choice A. Let's hold on to it and see what else we get. Answer choice B says, shortly after the new water heater was installed, Jimmy's uncle came to live with him, doubling the size of the household. Okay, so answer choice B is telling us that we have more people living in the house. Could that explain why the gas bill goes up? Absolutely. If you've got more people who are going to take a shower, more dishes that need to be cleaned, right? This is all going to mean a need to heat more water. And so that could increase the gas bill, even though the water heater is more efficient. So answer choice B seems like it's going to explain the paradox. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice C, after having done his laundry at a laundromat, Jimmy bought and started using a gas dryer when he replaced his water heater. All right, so Jimmy's now pretty happy about the fact that he's got a new water heater, and instead of going to the laundromat, he's doing that stuff at home. Right? This is new work. It's not necessarily, this is a new appliance actually. Right? So it's a gas dryer. It meets the requirement as being a gas appliance, but this could explain why the gas bill went up. Answer choice D says that Jimmy's utility company raised the rates for gas consumption following installation of the new water heater. If the rates went up, well, then even if Jimmy's using less gas, it may still mean that the bill overall is up. That explains it. Let's get rid of answer choice D. Answer choice E says that unusually cold weather following installation of the new water heater resulted in heavy gas usage. Well, heavy gas usage could explain why the bill went up, even if we're being more efficient with the water heater. Right? Now we maybe need to use more gas in order to heat the house because of the cold weather. This could explain the increase in the bill. Let's get rid of it. And that means that answer choice A is the right answer. Another example. Try this one on your own, and when you're ready to discuss, hit play again. All right, so during the 19th century, the French Academy of Art was a major financial sponsor of painting and sculpture in France. Sponsorship by private individuals had decreased dramatically by this time. Because the Academy discouraged innovation in the arts, there was little innovation in 19th century French sculpture. Yet 19th century French painting showed a remarkable degree of innovation. And the question asks us to explain the difference, right? Here's the comparison between the amount of innovation in French painting and the amount of innovation in French sculpture during the 19th century. So initially, we're told during the 19th century, the French Academy of Art was a major financial sponsor of painting and sculpture in France. Sponsorship by private individuals had decreased dramatically. Because the Academy discouraged innovation in the arts, there was little innovation in 19th century French sculpture. Now remember, the Academy was a sponsor of both sculpture and painting. So if that led to little innovation in 19th century French sculpture, one would expect that to lead to the same result with French painting. And yet, in the last sentence, 19th century French painting showed a remarkable degree of innovation. Right? So how come painting showed so much innovation when sculpture did not? Well, maybe even though the French Academy was a major financial sponsor of both painting and sculpture, it's possible that the French Academy was a much greater contributor to sculpture than to painting. And so that could explain their outsized influence. So now it's time to anticipate what the answer might sound like. And so if we can come up with a couple of good ideas, we'll be ready for the answer choices. So what could explain the difference? Well, we know that the French Academy was a major financial sponsor of both painting and sculpture. But saying that both are sponsored by the French Academy doesn't really tell us the level of engagement of the French Academy with each. It's definitely still possible that the French Academy was a much more significant contributor to sculptors than to painters. And if the French Academy supported the sculptors more than the painters, that might explain for the greater influence that the French Academy had on the sculptors than on the painters. Or maybe there's another influence out there that was heavily influencing the painters. So even though the French Academy was investing heavily in both painters and sculptors, the painters had some other influence, some other group of people who were investing in them. And those other investors were highly innovative and encouraged it, right? So it could be the case that the painters were being positively influenced by these other innovators, or it could be the case that the level of influence the French Academy had on both the sculptors and the painters wasn't exactly the same in terms of its ratio. So now let's look at the answer choices. Answer choice A says that in France in the 19th century, the French Academy gave more of its financial support to painting than it did to sculpture. The key here is that it gave more support to painting than it did to sculpture. But this is the opposite of what we're looking for. If it had been the case that the financial support had gone towards the sculpture, that could explain the lack of innovation among sculptors. So this deepens the paradox. Let's get rid of answer choice A. Answer choice B says, the French Academy in the 19th century financially supported a greater number of sculptors than painters. So that looks okay. Right? This is kind of like suggesting that the French Academy had more support going towards the sculptors than the painters. But individual painters received more support on average than individual sculptors. The first half of answer choice B sounds great. But the second half of answer choice B says that individual painters receive more support. This is going back the other direction again. We don't want the painters receiving as much support as the sculptors. So this actually also seems to be deepening the paradox again. Let's get rid of answer choice B. Answer choice C says, because stone was so much more expensive than paint and canvas, far more unsponsored paintings were produced than were unsponsored sculptures in France during the 19th century. So this is talking about the number of unsponsored paintings and sculptures produced. And now remember, unsponsored ones would be those that are not supported by the French Academy. If there was more unsponsored paintings, maybe that's where the innovation came from. This actually seems like it might help explain the situation. Let's hold on to answer choice C. Answer choice D says that very few of the artists in France in the 19th century who produced sculptures also produced paintings. Answer choice D does a pretty good job of making sure that the two groups are separate, that they're not the same individuals overlapping with each other. But suggesting that the two types of artists are separate doesn't explain the difference between them. Answer choice E says that although the Academy was the primary sponsor of sculpture and painting, the total amount of financial support that French sculptors and painters received from sponsors declined during the 19th century. So one thing to notice about this is that it's talking about sculpture and painting concurrently in both instances. So everything that applies to sculpture applies to painting. Everything that applies to painting also applies to sculpture. Answer choice E applies to both groups equally, and so can't explain the difference again. And so that leaves us with answer choice C as the right answer. All right, last one. Go ahead and give this a try. When you think you've got the right answer, hit play again, and we'll work it through together. All right, welcome back. So we want to first figure out, what is that apparent paradox? What is the thing that we need to explain? The first sentence says that adjusted for inflation, the income earned from wool sales by a certain family of Australian sheep farmers grew substantially during the period from 1840 to 1860. This is because the price for wool sold on the international market was higher than the price paid on domestic markets. Great, so they could buy it domestically for cheap and sell it internationally for a lot. And the percentage and amount of its wool that this family sold internationally increased dramatically during that period. They're crushing it. But, and here's the problem, even though the family generated more income from selling their wool, they failed to enjoy a commensurate increase in prosperity. All right, so what's the expectation? Well, the expectation is that because this family is selling more wool and at greater profit margins, that you would think that they would actually be doing fairly well. But what actually turned out to be the case is that they did not get to experience that increase in prosperity commensurate with the increased revenue or the increased income that this family got from selling sheep wool. How can it be the case that there was no corresponding increase in prosperity? Well, maybe there was something negative that happened to the family that erased or wiped out any of the benefits that they were getting from selling the wool. And so we want to think about what could be potentially setting this family back. Well, one thing that might set them back is if the family's other income decreased. They tell us in the statements that their income from selling wool increased. And they also tell us that the percentage of their income that came from selling wool increased during this period. But that also implies that it wasn't 100%, that they're doing other things as well in order to generate profits from their sheep. So if anything negative happened to those other forms of profits, right, maybe that decrease in other income wiped out any increase in income that they were getting from selling their wool. Or possibly inflation could have erased any gains that they might have gotten. So it could be something that's focused on them personally as a family, or it could be a bigger macro trend that affects everybody. So long as we can see how this family's gains might have been wiped out by some other losses, that would explain why they did not get a commensurate increase in prosperity, even though they got more income from selling their wool. All right, let's look at the choices. Answer choice A says, at the end of the 1800s, prices in general in Australia rose more rapidly than did the wholesale price of wool sold domestically. Now, this looks pretty good. Right? The second half of this answer choice is one of the things that we anticipated. It essentially says that the inflation could have wiped out any gains that this family got to their income. But here's the trap associated with answer choice A. It starts with the words at the end of the 1800s. And if we look very carefully, this family and the time period that we're discussing is between 1840 and 1860. That is not at the end of the 1800s. And answer choice A, well, it's perfect otherwise. It's out of scope because it's dealing with the wrong time period. Answer choice B says the prices of wool sold to domestic markets by Australian sheep farmers decreased dramatically during the period in question. So if the prices of wool sold to domestic markets decreased, well, that should increase the profits for this family, which is selling that wool internationally. Right? This is only going to make the situation more confusing. This deepens the paradox. And let's get rid of answer choice B. Answer choice C says that the international and domestic prices for mutton, sheepskin, and certain other products produced by all Australian sheep farmers fell sharply during the period in question. Notice that these are prices for other products produced from sheep, and that the price of these products fell sharply. Not only that, but these are products that are produced by all Australian sheep farmers, including this family. So if the other products are falling in price, maybe this fall in price is outweighing any advantage that the family was getting from selling its sheep wool on the international market. This actually looks like it has a chance of explaining why the family did not experience an increase in prosperity. So let's hold on to answer choice C and see what happens. Answer choice D says that competition in wool sales increased during the period in question, leaving Australian wool producers in a less favorable position than previously. So this is saying that Australian wool producers were in a less favorable position than previously, But notice that this is talking about competition in wool sales. Right? So if the competition in wool sales had a negative impact, this is not dealing with other forms of income that this family might have had. This is dealing directly with the income that was supposedly going up and they were supposedly benefiting from. We know that the family was able to generate more income from selling wool. Answer choice D attacks that idea that this family was benefiting from wool sales. It doesn't explain how they could be benefiting from wool sales and yet not benefiting overall in general. So answer choice D is like half scope. It's only dealing with half of the issue. It doesn't show how they can both be true at the same time. Answer choice E says that among Australian sheep farmers, the percentage who made their living exclusively from international wool sales increased significantly during the period in question. So this does speak to a booming market for international wool sales. And so this does speak to the first half of the situation, that the family was able to experience some kind of a benefit with regard to the wool sales. But it does not explain how this family failed to experience a generalized increase in prosperity. So again, this one is half scope. It only addresses half of the issue. It's not going to explain the two statements collectively, and that leaves us with answer choice C as the right answer. It might be that while their sale of wool was doing well, their sale of other kinds of sheep-related products was doing very poorly, and that's the reason why they weren't able to get some kind of an increase in their overall prosperity during this period. So the trap answers you want to be on the lookout for are those that are out of scope, answer choices that bring up something that has no bearing on the statements, can't explain the discrepancy, right? And so out of scope is still a common trap answer type. Half scope is going to be a new trap answer type for paradox questions. So if you see an answer choice that addresses only one of the two statements that you're trying to reconcile, that would be an answer choice that's simply half scope. 20% of all wrong answers are wrong because they explain the paradox. What that tells us is that there are a lot of except questions on this particular question type. Answer choices that do the opposite of what you want, answer choices that deepen the paradox. 17% of wrong answers are wrong because they're making the situation worse and not better. 4% of wrong answer choices are wrong because they're an idea that would apply to both groups and therefore can't explain the difference between the two groups. 3% of answer choices are wrong because they're building in a relevant relationship, something that can't really help explain the difference. They bring in the right terms, but they put them together in a way that has no real important meaning for the statements above. And then on paradox questions, we also want to be on the lookout for answer choices that are simply too weak. Answer choices that can be very, very close but not very strong can get us into trouble. So 22% of answer choices are wrong on paradox questions because they're not strong enough to explain the thing that needs to be explained. In summary, you spot a paradox question with language cues in the question stem. You're looking for resolves the apparent paradox, or reconciles the apparent discrepancy, or explains the finding. And be on the lookout for except questions because you're going to get a lot of them on paradox questions. The reasoning structures that you want to be on the lookout for on paradox questions are comparison and causation. Comparison is in almost every paradox question, and so is causation. And that's typically because the statements will provide some kind of a difference, a distinction between two things, and the right answer will provide an explanation or a causal mechanism for that difference. The trap answers you want to be on the lookout for when working on paradox questions are those that are out of scope, those that are too weak, those that make the situation worse and deepen the paradox, those that are half scope and only apply to one of the two sides, the two statements that you're trying to reconcile, those that apply to both when you're trying to explain a difference between two things, and answer choices that build irrelevant relationships or irrelevant comparisons. So that's it for today's lesson on paradox questions. I invite you to check out these other videos or visit us today at lsatlab.com.